Michael and Middleton here, continuing on with The Great Deep, my allegorical fiction novel. One of 20 books I have out in publication, I believe. If this is the first video you're running across, as always, I will put this up so you can pause it and read the little introduction about the book on the top here. Look for the links where you can find my books, as well as the charity that they all support 100% in the description of the video, and follow this link to the Good Books playlist on my YouTube channel to find the previous readings. This is chapter 15. I'm going to try to get a couple more done today, though the glare's starting to bother my eyes. Chapter 15. William was so overwhelmed by his experience that day that it was some time before he accepted Sador's invitation to visit the Ankara village again. However, he did keep the promise he had made to Enid about concealing the passageway he'd created in the back wall of the fort. The morning following his first visit to the Ankara, he devised a plan and returned to the fort. He first asked to borrow some tools from the tractor barn. "Sure, boy, use whatever you'd like," Mary said. "Just be sure to put things back where you found them when you're done." Emptying the prior contents of his backpack, he slipped in a claw hammer and some rusty old saw which hung on the back wall of the barn. Searching the number of dusty shelves, he located an old mayonnaise jar filled with a variety of nails. He placed this in his backpack as well. The realization then hit him that the glass jar would probably shatter as it rattled against the hammer inside the backpack. He removed the jar from the backpack, set it aside, and thought for a moment. "Well, I'm going to need a blanket or a sheet or something anyway." Leaving his backpack where it lay, William began to take a survey of the barn's contents. He searched through a number of cabinets and storage bins, but this effort proved fruitless. He did find quite a few cleaning rags and old towels, but nothing came even close to the size that he needed. Then he remembered all the family stuff that was in storage up in the loft. "I'll bet I can find something that'll work up there," he thought. He climbed the steep staircase leading up to the loft. About half of the elevated platform was occupied by various boxes, crates, and a few miscellaneous pieces of furniture, which they had no use for at that point. Draping over his dad's old recliner was a large quilt that had been used to protect his mom's full-length mirror during the move out from Reno. "That's perfect," he thought. Pulling the quilt from the recliner, he tossed it over the side of the loft and placed back down the staircase to ground level. He then dragged the quilt over to his backpack. He wrapped the jar of nails up in the quilt and began stuffing it into the backpack. However, it soon became evident that it was just far too big to fit. "I guess I'll have to carry the quilt by itself," he concluded. Removing the jar from the quilt, he wrapped it in a couple of old towels he had found instead. He then stuffed the padded jar back into the backpack. Folding the quilt, he looked around the barn again and gathered a half dozen or so discarded 2x4s and a few other scrap pieces of lumber. These he tightly bundled together with a piece of baling wire. William now took stock of his growing pile of supplies, running through a mental checklist. Need something else, he thought. Surveying the shelves again, he spotted a stack of a dozen old license plates and a shiny chrome hubcap. He retrieved these and barely managed to stuff them into his backpack. Zipping the backpack closed again proved to be quite a task, but he managed it after several minutes of trying. Realizing that he hadn't yet asked permission to ride Chester again, William returned to the house in order to do so. It was almost lunchtime, so after getting permission to ride Chester, he stayed to eat before returning to the tractor barn. He moved the backpack, quilt, and scrap lumber next door to the horse barn, and then called Chester in from the pasture, leading him to where the saddle and other supplies were kept. After saddling Chester, he draped the quilt over the horse's hindquarters, strapping it in place with a pair of rawhide ties that hung from the back of the saddle. After several minutes of deliberating over how to transport the lumber, he came up with a workable plan. He tied one end of a long rope to the saddle horn. He then tied the other end around the bundled lumber, cinching it tightly. After swinging up into the saddle, he braced the rope over his shoulder and across the top of his backpack. He decided that he would drag the lumber along the path out to the fort. It wasn't exactly comfortable for William or the horse, but he figured that it would get the job done. Enduring several courses of "What in the world is that boy up to now?" he began his trek out to the fort. Mary met him at the pasture gate, opening it to let him through. He responded to her inquisitions with, "I just wanted to spruce up the fort a bit, Grandma." After a somewhat difficult ride, William dismounted near the mouth of the cave. He untied the rope from the saddle horn and removed the quilt from Chester's back before leading the horse over to the now familiar oak tree. He tied Chester to a low-hanging branch and returned to the cave. Picking up the bundle of lumber, he tossed it through the opening. It tumbled neatly all the way down to the bottom. He then draped the quilt across his shoulder and followed the lumber down into the fort. When he reached the floor of the cave, he took hold of the rope that was attached to the lumber. He dragged the bundle across the floor to the back wall. He next removed the quilt and backpack from his shoulders, setting them aside. Untying the bundle of lumber, he laid the boards out on the floor of the cave. When his eyes had sufficiently adjusted to the dimness, he laid the lumber out in a crisscrossing pattern. Removing the other supplies from his backpack, he nailed the boards together, forming a crude frame somewhat taller and wider than the hole he'd chiseled in the back wall of the fort. He used the saw he'd brought along to trim off the few overhanging ends of lumber before laying the quilt on top of the frame. He then tack-nailed the quilt in place, forming a wall of sorts. Next, he flipped the frame over and nailed the leftover quilt material to the backside of the boards. Finally, he stood this new creation up and placed it in front of the hole in the back wall of the cave. The fit was perfect. It covered the hole completely. Now, William dragged the couch over, placing it against the makeshift wall. After using the chrome hubcap and old license plates to decorate the new backdrop, he returned the tools and jar of nails to his backpack. Pacing across the floor of the cave, he admired his work from a distance. Not bad, he thought. It does kind of brighten the place up a bit, and no one would think to look behind it. Satisfied that he had completed his task, William collected his backpack and climbed back out of the cave. He crossed the dusty field, untied Chester from the oak tree, and swung up into the saddle. He knew that he would want to visit the Ankara village again, but not right away. He was simply too overloaded with revelation for the time being. He had been profoundly disturbed by the vision of his lower nature that he had seen in the Pool of Truth. His heart and mind simply needed time to process things. After arriving home, William unsaddled Chester and returned him to the pasture. William himself then returned to the house and indulged in an afternoon shower before playing a few games of pool. After dinner, he read a couple of chapters from The Beast Within before going to bed a bit earlier than usual.